As many of you probably already know, Roe versus Wade, which was a 50-year Supreme Court precedent, was overturned by the Dobbs decision several months ago. And ever since that, I mean, things have been pretty reasonable. You know, nobody's been doing a lot of bad things. States have actually been reacting with measured responses.
You lie. Let me throw my shoe at you.
No, I'm just fucking with you. 14 of them have completely banned abortion. Georgia, so far, has passed a 6-week abortion ban. I believe Florida recently passed it, but it hasn't gone into effect yet. We have
DeSantis.
Yeah, we have a 12-week ban from Nebraska, a 15-week ban from Arizona, Florida. We have a 18-week ban in Utah, a 20-week ban in North Carolina. And then in some other states, there are some restrictions around the 22-week level or the viability level. But for the most part, the rest of the country, abortion is still protected. And in some states, there's actually been a passage of more protections on abortion, which
couldn't be Virginia.
No, not Virginia. But it is still legal in Virginia. So yeah, that's the overall state of where we are. As we warned, there have been many states that have passed restrictive abortion laws. And in some cases, like in the case of Alabama and Arkansas, they don't even have exceptions for rape or incest.
Well, I mean, that makes sense for Alabama now.
Ouch.
I'm not sorry.
Shots fired.
If you're going to act a fool, I'm going to treat you like one.
Yeah.
The whole state of Alabama.
But I think it makes sense for us to also spend some time talking about some of the real human costs to this, because we can look at these numbers and we can think those numbers are terrible, those numbers are awful, those numbers represent people. But I think to get the full picture of how much of a horrific impact that these abortion bans have had, we really need to talk about some of the specific stories, some of the specific disasters that have occurred as a result of these bans.
Yeah, there's a whole lot. All of it was entirely foreseeable. It is all of the things that you may have heard abortion rights activists talk about for many years are really listed there. I know I have felt frustration because I've been talking about Roe v. Wade being slowly chipped away at and being really clearly set up to be overturned for years. And I had people in my life who were like, oh, you're just always so worried about this political stuff. And I don't really want to engage with that. And now it's really relevant to them and it's in their minds right up front and center, which is not a bad thing. But all of this was foreseeable. All of this was extremely and explicitly laid out, like just all the time. So it's interesting to watch a bunch of some legislators and physicians say, gosh, this wasn't intended to do that. Yeah. Including like one lawmaker who helped with drafting a particular bill and who said, well, this was never intended to prevent medically necessary abortions, just elective ones. In the case of, you know, helping someone avoid death, this abortion ban shouldn't affect them. Here's the thing. All pregnancies carry the risk of death. These fucking idiots don't seem to understand that point, but I'm really going to harp on it.
Yeah, I mean, we've made this point on the pod before. Pregnancy is a life-threatening condition. Pregnancy is a life-threatening condition. And the way that a lot of these laws end up working, the ones that, you know, even when they do have those exceptions for the life of the carrier, which I believe almost all of them, if not all of them, have that carve-out, even when you have that, the way that's often translated to is unless you are dying on the table, which means you have all of these instances where there are these pregnant women that have either a non-viable fetus or they have some type of life-threatening condition beyond just normal pregnancy that will result in them potentially dying or potentially being at risk of dying later down the line of their pregnancy. But because they are not dying on the table in that exact moment, they're forced to wait until it becomes an emergency And then physicians are allowed to step in. And at that point, the procedure is more invasive, it's more damaging, and it's, and it's more costly. It costs more.
So a couple of things I ran across in my research that seemed to be the issue is that these laws are written very vaguely.
Yeah.
Now, I do ascribe some malicious intent to that. I think that the lawmakers who write this don't truly give a fuck about pregnant people. I'm going to say pregnant people, by the way. Anyone who has a problem with that can fuck off. Because yes, it's true that this is a women's rights issue because the majority of people who become pregnant do identify as women, and this country hates women. But also, there are people who become pregnant who are trans, and this country also hates trans people. So I'm going to say pregnant people. And also, these lawmakers don't give a fuck about them.
Yeah.
They really don't. And I believe
a lot of these laws are virtue signals.
Well, I think a lot of the vagueness does come from that, but I also think a significant portion of it comes from these lawmakers being too moronic to actually understand anything about pregnancy or like the reproductive system in general. So they think, like that lawmaker I quoted, that they've made something very clear, but they don't have the expertise to legislate this. It's almost like they shouldn't be.
Yeah.
Another issue that seems to come up is that there are hospitals and medical providers who are anti-abortion, and they are using this as an excuse to deny care. They are using it for plausible deniability. In some cases, it's also a risk aversion thing. It's not always malicious. There was a physician that stopped providing abortions in her practice because she was seeing that her state was likely to have that go into effect. And she said, as a Black provider in this very rural, very conservative, very white supremacist state, I don't feel safe providing this. Someone could try to inflict legal damage on me that I cannot recover from.
Yeah.
A lot of organizations have had to close out their services. And it's also worth noting that a lot of these practices that provided abortion services are now having to just shut down completely because without the abortion services, they can't offer full and comprehensive services for anyone. So those are your wellness checkups, your birth control. If you have maybe uterine cancer or something, like those are the places where you get screened for things like cancers or tumors or cysts. That would be your first stop, and those are just disappearing.
Yeah, yeah. And a lot of these other non-abortion related things that doctors are having to cut down on are the things that prevent unplanned pregnancy to begin with. I mean, when you have businesses that were initially focused on preventing unplanned parenthood, a lot of those clinics are not just providing abortions, they're providing contraception, they're providing education, they're providing birth control. And guess what? Birth control reduces the likelihood of abortion because it reduces the likelihood of unplanned pregnancy. And basically this just results, I mean, Michael and I have talked about this in the past. There are lots of ways that a society can try to reduce the number of abortions that happen, and bans are the least effective and most destructive method of doing it.
Oh, I forgot to mention, by the way, in those states with the really firm anti-abortion laws, because a lot of these obstetric and gynecological practices are either having to shut down or severely limit what they offer, a lot of medical residents are choosing, like medical students, people who will then go into residency, are choosing not to practice in those states because they don't believe that they will get all of the care and education that they need because they're not even teaching them some of what they need to know if they're not going to stay in that state about abortion care. So not only will they be losing all the practitioners who decide to leave the state, they will also lose medical, like upcoming practitioners from their state. It's just another key example. Not that I don't expect you have like a wide conservative audience, but if you happen to have someone in your life that maybe listens to you and is conservative leaning, trying to explain to them, these legislators don't care about y'all. They just don't.
Yeah.
They don't care if you can't get anything. Side note, OBGYNs are who pregnant people seek out. So in that state where you're going to be forced to be pregnant, you will now not be able to get as much care because there's going to be a reduction in the available staff to assist you.
Yeah. And the thing is, I think that I like how you're drawing that distinction between potentially like conservative voters, conservative leaning people and legislators, because in my experience, there are huge chunks of conservative voters or, conservative, just regular everyday citizens that when they are confronted with a lot of the implications of what is going on, they might be thinking like they might have passively thought to themselves like, I'm against abortion, I'm against killing babies. But then they hear a story about, like the 10-year-old, which I'm sure that we're going to talk about in a bit, who was raped and then had to go out of state to get an abortion?
I believe so. Yeah.
Yeah. They're horrified when they hear that, or they hear instances, some other examples that we're probably going to be going into of women who have almost died because they weren't able to get an abortion quick enough. And I think even a lot of conservative voters will hear that and think, okay, I don't like abortion, but that's not okay.
Yes, actually, that leads really well into something that I think a lot of people already know, which is that the majority of Americans still support abortion rights.
Yeah.
61% say they mostly support abortion rights, and 37% count themselves as opposed. Now, that is near record high in the Marist survey. And so a third of Republicans qualify themselves as mostly supporting abortion rights. Not that that is total, but that's still relevant. And a lot of people who mostly support abortion rights say that they or someone they know had an abortion.
That's interesting.
Yeah. That includes 69% of Democrats, 59% of independents, and even a majority of Republicans at 54%.
Yeah. And look, a third of Republicans, that is still a significant chunk of Republicans. And this is why on this show we really try to make sure that the enemy is not your neighbor who has a Trump flag out back or whatever. Your enemy is the legislators that are systematically taking away your rights and the lobbyists that are paying them to do it.
Yeah. And again, a lot of the people even who would consider themselves somewhat opposed to abortion, a lot of them aren't even okay with a 6-week ban. A lot of them think it should be restrained to the first trimester.
Yeah.
It's one of those things where people who live in the real world often know, okay, 6 weeks, as I'm sure that you all have talked about, and I'm sure most of your listeners understand, 6 weeks is almost nothing.
Yeah.
Unless you were trying to get pregnant, you might not even know, because if you are 2 weeks late for a period, that's not that uncommon. Also, keeping in mind, even if you're only a week late for a period, that's pretty common. If you take a pregnancy test right after a week, you have a week to figure out the money for an abortion, possibly getting off work, finding transportation, depending on what's going to happen. If you're ordering this through the mail, which now you can't, you're having to wait for these things. So it's really just ridiculous to expect that someone can organize that within a week to 2 weeks. It's just not possible.
Yeah. So what are some of the horror stories that we've been hearing so far about some of the real world impacts and anecdotal impacts that have happened?
So obviously, trigger warning for people.
Yeah.
I would just say if you are feeling like you can't hear about this, you should take care of yourself and not listen. There will be some descriptions of medical trauma, some descriptions of general buffoonery from legislators that might just raise your blood pressure sky high.
Yeah.
I think one of the horrors that I think it seems underwhelming at first is just the lack of knowledge from the legislators. Genuinely, or even just from populations who support total bans, where they will say things like, well, if you're saying it's 2 weeks after a missed period. Why don't you just take a pregnancy test after every time you have sex? Yo, it doesn't happen instantaneously. Without going into this very long description of pregnancy, it can take a while for sperm to make its way through the cervix, for an embryo to actually implant on your uterine wall. All of that can take a while, let alone the fact that that can't show up in a pregnancy test. They have some good pregnancy tests that can detect things pretty early, but no pregnancy test in the world that exists will ever detect if you're pregnant the moment you finished having sex.
Who said that?
That wasn't a specific legislator I found. It's just sort of a sentiment that's been echoed from a few people.
I hear that and I'm like, in order to say something like that, you must not have sex very often.
Well, I mean, it's kind of like when you hear someone say, I don't understand why women can't just like hold their periods in until they go to the bathroom. And you'd think that only one human would ever be stupid enough to say that, but apparently not just one human. Yeah. I don't think it's a huge portion, but I think it's again indicative of a lack of understanding of how reproduction works, which makes sense when you consider sex education in the United States.
Yeah.
So that's one of the horrors. And I think that's important. Again, these legislators I've talked before, they don't necessarily understand how the human body works, let alone how reproductive systems work, let alone all of the risks that are part of pregnancy. I will say I am currently a pregnant person. Yeah. And y'all, it's scary. You go to doctor's offices and they check everything. They're like, hey, you had this one abnormal test and we're concerned that this could mean you have this condition. That can happen. Some other people might never have any issues come up during their pregnancy. It's also worth considering disability status, chronic health status. Anything can happen when you're pregnant. That is the point I'm making. That's something that no one else can really determine the risk for you. You have to be able to determine the risk and decide if you want to carry a pregnancy, because up to birth and actually after birth, you can have severe bodily harm, including up to death. Yeah. So some of the specific horrors that I encountered are just, a lot of them are about people who wanted or needed abortion care rather from medical necessity and were denied and put into dangerous medical situations. One story I read was about these two friends, actually, two women who were best friends in Florida. And they both had a condition called previability preterm pre-labor rupture of the membranes, PPROM, which occurs in less than 1% of pregnancies. It was just a coincidence that both of these women ended up having it at the same time. Both of these women met because they were going through infertility, and they met in support groups with each other. They both wanted their pregnancies. They both had made it past the first trimester and were very excited about that. In this case, one woman had her water break 6 weeks ahead of when a fetus can survive on its own, drove to the emergency room, and the doctor said that she was having PPROM, and then sent her home with antibiotics because as the physicians were interpreting Florida law, they really didn't feel like they could count that as life-threatening because it's less clear-cut. Now, like, fetuses can't really survive without the amniotic sac, and especially at this stage. So what they normally would do is induce someone, or possibly even do an abortion or a surgical procedure, and to end it. Instead, in this case, that woman had to be sent home. And later on, when she was at a hair salon, she started noticing that she was in labor. She went to a bathroom. She labored on the toilet, knowing that this fetus was not going to be viable. She bled a lot. She actually had complications afterwards. And it's noted here that probably she would have experienced all of these things in the hospital. And that's the issue. because of these medical conditions, she was not considered at life-threatening risk. Now, granted, she could have developed sepsis from something like this, so that's why they sent her home with antibiotics. Granted, she could hemorrhage because that's always a risk of birth. The reason why it was such an issue that they wouldn't see her and let her stay in the hospital is because the physicians were trying to say that they can't say clear cut that this person will have an irreversible physical impairment. So in this case, this woman had a pretty traumatic experience of going to the hospital, hemorrhaging. At one point, the doctors did tell her husband that, she could very well die. And if she did live, they may have to take her uterus out. And that was devastating to a couple who tried for so many years to get pregnant. In the end, they were able to preserve her uterus. She went to her clinic fertility doctor, and sadly, there are some complications from that experience. None of that is necessarily directly related to not being able to have an induction or a surgical procedure to remove the fetus. You can't know. You can't know if she would have done better. There's no way to know. But the issue is that this woman was sent home when she had a medical urgency simply because it wasn't considered life-threatening enough.
Yeah. The problem with these bans, first off, from the freedom-based perspective, everybody should be able to decide what happens to their body and all that. But from the medical perspective, the Republicans like to paint the progressive position on abortion as being, we want everybody to be able to just go to the clinic and get an abortion up to the point of birth, regardless of whether or not there's viability or whatever. And that is such a mischaracterization, because the problem with bans is that even bans that say, up till this point, is that it limits options in cases like that. Because the reason why late-term abortions happen are either one, and I've said this before, but are either one, the person did not have financial access to an abortion earlier in their pregnancy. Number two, they did not have geographic access to an abortion earlier in their pregnancy. Or number three, there is some type of health complication. People aren't just waiting around thinking, well, I'm just going to wait until this is a fully formed fetus.
It's not like when you plan to go to the post office and you keep thinking, shit, I meant to stop by the post office for 4 weeks.
Yeah. That's not what this is. That's not what's happening. So the reason why having these bans, even if they are the less restrictive ones, why that's bad is because they're going to have these unintended consequences where there's going to be an issue where a hospital is going to need to make a decision about a person's life, and the idea that they have to consider legal ramifications when it comes to saving a pregnant person limits their ability to do their job.
So, yes, we will get into some of those unforeseen consequences. I mean, they kind of were foreseen, but I know what you're saying, that some of what...
Unforeseen by the people that crafted the legislation.
Or at least ostensibly. They would say that it's unforeseen. I don't truly believe that, because I think the people who crafted that legislation are vicious and hateful people. I think that another issue that has been coming up is just how many exceptions or exemptions to these bans exist. And that, again, is another issue. You can't legislate it because there are so many exceptions. Yeah. For example, so there are several people in Texas who were denied abortions, suing the state of Texas. Now, I believe it has started with 5 women, and I believe it's now been just added on as more people have experienced this. There were several stories that came out of that. Some of them were, something like someone's water breaking too early, and that this person feared infection, so she flew to Colorado to get a termination. There were 2 Texas doctors who are suing the state on behalf of themselves and their patients because they're just saying, we're threatened by losing our medical license, fines, and up to 99 years in prison. So doctors and hospitals turning people away, it's bad for the patients and it's bad for the physicians. There were also issues, and this is something that maybe people aren't as aware of, where abortion might be necessary in cases of multiple pregnancies. Here's why. Multiple pregnancies increase your risk and the risk of fetal harm exponentially. So in one of the cases of these women who are suing, they had twins. It was a high-risk pregnancy, and they were told, if you can reduce this pregnancy by 1 twin, I believe 1 twin was not as likely to have a viable birth. They said, it would really save the chances of the other twin. So that person chose to do that because they did want that pregnancy and they did want that viability. It's another situation where people don't think about, if you end up with multiple pregnancies, there are a whole lot of risks involved, and you might have one fetus that is not viable or has major complications and one fetus that doesn't, or you may have more than 2 fetuses. All of that increases your risk. All of that is relevant. A reduction is an abortion. It's just, instead of aborting all the fetuses there, it's one or, possibly more. I cannot stress enough that abortion doesn't just happen to, the idea people have in their head of irresponsible people who have lots of unprotected sex, who don't care about accountability. It's not that. It's usually not that. And even if it is, people make mistakes.
Yeah.
It's weird to say, let's punish you and a future child for a mistake.
Yeah.
Weird flex, conservatives. Weird flex.
Yeah. Yeah. At the end of the day, I think Jess makes a really good point. A lot of these consequences were very much foreseen and warned by pro-choice activists and advocates. And at the end of the day, the legislators that are enacting this, a lot of it is just virtue signaling to their constituency, because this was the issue that Republicans had been using to keep their base in line. And I honestly do believe that most of them never thought anything would ever come of it because they assumed that Roe would never get overturned. And now that it has, they have to actually do what they said they were going to do. And they realize that it's a lot more destructive than they thought.
So I think that's a lot more generous to some of these anti-abortion people and some of these legislators than I would be. In particular, there's a really, really awful clip, which I'm sure you can find, and some people may have already seen, from Laura Streitman, who's Cincinnati Right to Life leader, when she was talking about there was a 10-year-old girl who was raped and then went to Indiana for an abortion. And she said, and I quote, "While a pregnancy may have been difficulty on a 10-year-old body, a woman's body is designed to carry life." So, also listed in her argument there, she talked about how, when her daughter was 10, she liked playing with dolls and wanted a baby sister. So, 10-year-olds would enjoy a baby. Maybe they wouldn't enjoy pregnancy, but, a woman's body is designed to carry life. Now,
yeah. And when I was a kid, I played cops and robbers. I guess that means that now that I'm an adult, I want to go rob a fucking bank.
We should break the banks. So it's really, it's something that you think that only a mustache twisting villain who's over the top would be doing, like in Gilead. But unfortunately, there are people who think this way, who think it's okay. Side note, a 10-year-old isn't a woman, for anyone who is confused.
Yeah.
A 10-year-old is not a woman. And the risk of complications and death are really high for people who are under, really from ages 10 to 19, they're considered higher risk. So we've talked about women in Texas are trying to sue the state of Texas. Y'all, we also need to remember that in the United States, we often get stuck in our brains thinking about, just how everything happens to us, and we're so focused on that. The world is watching, and it's a lot. Basically, there has been a letter that is appealing to the United States nations to intervene over the destruction of abortion rights in the United States. This letter has been sent by, abortion rights groups, and it's been really well researched. We'll have the link to a breakdown of this so that you can read on it. But some of the things that they cite about, kind of how dangerous this is and what it involves is that, some of the documentation from these women's rights groups describe difficulty for people in the United States for accessing abortion in case of miscarriage, forced travel across state lines in emergencies, denial of care in cases of ectopic pregnancy. Side note, ectopic pregnancies are never viable. Anyone who tells you otherwise is lying. That fetus cannot survive, and it can kill the person who's carrying that fetus, and it will rupture, and it will be dangerous. Hospitals delaying care until the woman's health has deteriorated to a level most certainly to fit within the narrow and vague risk to life of the mother exceptions. Professionals withholding information, fearing that their advice could violate anti-abortion laws. Reduced access to non-reproductive health care, for example, chemotherapy, because there have been instances where people who need chemotherapy for cancer treatment can't get their cancer treatment because it's a risk to this fetus that they're carrying, even though them dying from cancer is also a risk to this fetus. The infliction of serious psychological harm on women and girls forced to carry an unwanted pregnancy. Complications for adolescents forced to give birth. Reduce access to other forms of reproductive health care, including contraception. Heightened risk of violence faced by pregnant individuals in abusive relationships. Yet another reason some people delay getting an abortion, as was the case for one woman who described not being able to even see prenatal care because her abusive partner wouldn't let her go. And then she finally got away from him only to discover that she was just past the date when she could get an abortion in her state. And pregnant individuals who basically avoid prenatal care so that they are not surveilled. All of these are implications. I would definitely recommend you read up on this appeal to the UN because it's pretty comprehensive and it helps describe just the state of the United States in general. So, yet another bummer. Planned Parenthood has announced some layoffs. They are going to have to cut back on the amount of their workforce, about 10 to 20% of their national workforce. It's real bad here. Like I said, we live in the bad place. There have also been issues with the abortion pill, mifepristone, being legislated out. There was a challenge that the FDA somehow didn't go through the proper approval process for this pill. This is one of the most commonly used medications in medication abortion. It seems that the result of an appeal on that judgment was that you can still access that pill. Unfortunately, what it seems like now is that it can no longer be mailed. They're also limiting when it can be used. They're also putting a bunch of stipulations in that. So this is relevant for people who are living in states where they can't get access to abortion. They can no longer appeal to sites that will mail it to them, depending on the state. So I'm not sure that that's completely gone into effect. I'm not sure it actually will stop people either, because even if the United States stops sending that, you can still go through international suppliers. And this brings me to not really ending on a good note, but ending on a note of keep fighting, keep trying to fuck them up, which is that there are things that people can do if you want to promote abortion rights. And there are things that are being done, so it might give you some hope. There are websites such as mayday.health where, they tell you how you can order abortion pills. They tell you about free and anonymous legal questions, like a helpline where you can talk about legal questions, a miscarriage and abortion hotline for medical questions, surveillance and self-defense. There are countless social media medical professionals, like social media influencers who are medical professionals, giving advice to people where they're talking about things like, hey, if you had an abortion and you need to go to a hospital to follow up on your care, just so you know, there's no legal way or no medical way for them to know that you had an abortion unless you tell them, because miscarriage and abortion are often treated the same way. Again, I'm not a medical professional. You should seek those out on your own, but they are trying to give people as much information as they can to help them. There are medical professionals who are being careful about how they document abortion or disclosures of that because they care about their patients. There are even pilots who are trying to help people access abortion in other states and also access gender affirming care. There's a group called Elevated Access that has basically been able to recruit some pilots who are volunteer pilots who have access to private planes where they would be putting in the hours anyway. And they will pick up people in these states who need to get to these appointments where it might take them days. They might have to stay in a hotel. They might not easily be able to do that. And instead they can fly there. Or it also helps people who maybe don't have the documentation to fly, such as victims of domestic violence where they've had their legal documents taken away, or undocumented people. So there's also, if you go locally and you want to help, you can look up how to help people access abortion. There are a lot of abortion rights groups who will talk about people donating money for travel expenses, maybe even helping people travel. There is an underground abortion rights network, and that's not nothing. It sucks that that's necessary, but as Nathan said, there are a lot of states who've gone full abortion ban, or at least very restrictive, and there are other states who saw this and decided to codify abortion protection. So if you're fortunate enough to live in one of those states, I would also be making sure that people in your life that you care about, you can also offer people places to stay. There are a lot of ways that you can help, even if you don't have money to assist.